Welcome to the third British Romantic flipped lesson for our major authors. This one is going to focus on the work of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in particular, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So make sure you have your notes. Make sure that you are ready to go with the important details. And I think we're going to be in good shape overall. Welcome to the Samuel Taylor Coleridge introductory flip lesson. So this is the third lesson that we have in with our British Romantics. So this one is going to focus primarily on the background of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's also going to focus on his major poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So that's my intended focus of this particular presentation. As I was doing my research for this over the last couple of days, I was struck by a quote by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It says, "The happiness of life is made up of minute fractions. The little, soon forgotten charities of a kiss or a smile or a kind look or a heartfelt compliment. The happiness of life is made up of minute fractions. The little, soon forgotten charities of a kiss or a smile, a kind look, or a heartfelt compliment. The little, soon forgotten charities of a kiss or a smile, a kind look, or a heartfelt compliment." So as you progress through this particular lesson, look for how Coleridge uses the sensuous nuance to get at his major themes and major ideas. And if you do that, I think you're going to find yourselves in good shape. So here we go. Good luck.
All right, let's talk about the Romantic era poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. We're going to talk more about his definition of imagination. To him, imagination has everything to do with the artistic creativity and spontaneity. It is the sovereign creative power. And he divides imagination into two subcategories, primary imagination and secondary imagination. Primary imagination is the human capacity to perceive, produce images, and give shape to an order to material that is perceived. Secondary imagination is the faculty that the poet used, not only to give shape and order to a given world, but mainly to build and create a new world. Now, to him, imagination is different from fancy in that fancy is more or less the poet's ability to use material which already exists to produce new images. It could also be a capacity that the poet has to shape old material into something different. An example would be like simile or metaphor. Um, just to further discuss Coleridge, what he thought the role of nature is. And to him, the material world, the natural images that are throughout nature, carry abstract ideas. That is, natural images have supernatural or abstract meanings. Um, they don't necessarily act as a moral guide or a source of consolation or happiness. They are not manifestation of God on earth. To him, they reflect, they're a reflection of the perfect world of ideas, which is not subject to time or space. Those are the views of imagination, fancy, and the role of nature as far as Samuel Taylor Coleridge goes.
So we have an opportunity to look at the major markers for The Rime of the Ancient Mariner by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. I'm trying to be redundant just to make sure it makes it into our notes. So let's talk here about atmosphere. Atmosphere, of course, in a poem is the overall tone and the overall feeling that the work sort of gives us as readers. I'm trying not to shake the table so it doesn't vibrate so much. But the dominant atmosphere of The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is uncanny and eerie. So it's designed to be a little foreboding in tone. It deals with potential of ghost-like ideas. It plays with concepts of the supernatural. So I think this uncanny and eerie tone is hugely significant. We know that it's built up through an accumulation of strange events. So the mariner on the ship, the strange storms, ultimately what happens to the crew, the two passengers he finds in the boat, all of this is significant to the development of the content of the poem, but also extraordinarily important for how it ties to theme and to the religious metaphors and those kinds of things. So this is atmosphere. So again, it's built up through the accumulation of strange, mysterious events. We know, for example, that the mariner has a ghost-like appearance, and the way that he's portrayed contributes significantly to that ghost-like appearance. If it were me, and this is becoming kind of a mantra for me now, this would be a theme that I look to track, especially as we get into part 2, part 3, and part 4 of the poem. So again, I think that's significant. We know that the mariner has this uncanny ability to assert a hypnotic power on the wedding guest in the beginning of the poem. So I think that's certainly something of significance for us to pay attention to. We know that the ice contributes to the threatening presence. So the environment of the mariner's ship as he travels to the South Pole, hugely important. And I think the dead bodies of the mariner's crew and what happens to them and how they're sort of a suspended animation, this is all going to contribute. So several examples here of how these ideas all are going to make an impact on what Coleridge is trying to do with the atmosphere of the poem. Your takeaway from this is, as we review the poem itself, can you track details for how atmosphere functions? I think if you can do that, you're going to be in great shape.
Conversational poetry. The conversation poems are a group of at least 8 poems composed between 1795 and 1807. Each details a particular life experience which led to the poet's examination of nature and the role of poetry. They describe virtuous conduct and man's obligation to God, nature, and society, and ask if there is a place for simple appreciation of nature without having to actively dedicate one's life to altruism. Altruism is the belief in or practice of disinterested and selfless concern for the well-being of others. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is an account of a sea voyage to distant places with crime, death, and inhuman suffering as parts of the ghastly adventure. In true romantic style, it is highly imaginative, showcases an appreciation of nature, expresses emotions, indicates a presence of God, and contains nightmarish images. In the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the rhyme is a story of a mariner who is punished for killing an albatross. The albatross is a symbol of God's creation and of innocence. A dead albatross is a symbol of sin. His shipmates are also punished because they justify his crime. They die of thirst one by one, while the ship is stuck on the ocean under a blazing sun. The mariner's penance is even more terrible. He will return to his native country. However, he will be obliged to travel endlessly in order to tell people about his experience and teach them to love and respect all creatures of God. The poem starts out with 3 men going to a wedding, which is a happy occasion, and when they pass an old sailor, he begins speaking, and one of the men stays and listens, seemingly entranced by the old man, while the others continue on to the wedding. The mariner tells a story of a ghastly, horrific time at sea and how he made it out alive.
So when we talk here about form and the form of the poem and how it's developed, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner reproduces the traditional form of a ballad, B-A-L-L-A-D, but with some variations. So here's some characteristics of the ballad. The traditional ballad has 4-line stanzas rhyming in an A-B pattern. That means the end rhyme. Lines 1 and 3 are the same, and lines 2 and 4 are the same. So the stress pattern is 4-3, 4-3. So you're going to have alternating numbers of syllables per line. It creates a sing-songy effect. There's a storyline. It's simple and short for the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The narrative technique is direct speech, so the narrator is speaking directly to you so that you are engaged in the details of the actual poem. There are some universal themes in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner: love, death, revenge, God in particular. So again, love, death, revenge, God, and we even throw in the use of the supernatural and ghosts as a way to move the story forward. The main literary technique or the main poetry technique that we use here is going to be that of repetition. So you're going to notice those sing-songy elements as we go through. The poem is rich in sound effects and imagery. So there's a lot of that we're going to look at as we go through the text. And unlike in past years, I'm going to eke out a good chunk of time for us to cover this. So it's filled with sound effects and imagery. It fills repetition. It's got a lot of internal rhyme, alliteration, similes, and personification. So all of our figurative language that we had talked about earlier in the course of the particular term. So those are the ideas of form. Another idea here that I think we need to pay some very important attention to is that we can interpret this along two different avenues. So there is the religious interpretation of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So in short, and again, this should be in your notes, the religious interpretation is the killing of the albatross is a sin against God. That the crossbow is very much a reference to the crucifixion of Christ. Fairly complex, and there's a lot of research on this, but we'll have an opportunity to look at some of that as we go. The mariner's sufferings are a form of purgatory. So Coleridge develops this middle portion of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner as the mariner going through purgatory as he's waiting for the healing rain of baptism. Again, it's a lot right there. We're going to get to it. That's why there's fire imagery and water imagery in the poem. At the end, in Book the 6th and Book the 7th, when the mariner returns back to his home country, it's a loosely veiled reference to salvation and how he is redeemed as he goes through that particular process. Now that is a sort of quick and dirty way to look at the religious interpretation, and we can develop that further as we go. The other piece of this is the aesthetic interpretation. The mariner is seen as an artist, so aesthetic is art. So the mariner is seen as an artist who breaks the bounds of convention in his search for beauty and self-knowledge. That's a little touchy-feely, but I find it interesting because it puts a lot of focus on the character and why that's significant. So the mariner is seen as an artist who breaks the bounds of convention in his search for beauty and self-knowledge. He passes through a terrible period of trial and is eventually saved by the power of his imagination. So Mr. Krepp talked about the power of the imagination. So I think that's going to be something significant for us to look at in the poem and how it develops. So figure out what direction you want to take. Are you going to do the religious? Are you going to do the aesthetic? Are you going to do something in the middle there where they both meet? It's important to have it in front of us as we're going through and looking at the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the poem, and to make sure that we have everything that we need. So the important symbols in rhyme, there's 5 specific markers that I think are going to be of value to you moving forward. Now, the original plan in this was to go through and to create PowerPoint slides for each of the important symbols. I think what I'm going to do instead is just make sure we cover those briefly here, and then we can flesh them out as we go through the actual text. So the important symbols, I'm going to give you 5 here. So the wedding guest, uh, dominant figure in the beginning of the poem, and we come back to him at the end. The role of the hermit symbolizes an angel. This is the sort of the divine and how Coleridge sees it in the poem, especially when he returns to the land after his uh, journey through purgatory, if you will. That makes sense if you've listened to the other parts of this video or watch other parts of this video. We talked in class just yesterday or the day before about the symbolism of the moon. Contrast that with the symbolism of the sun and how it represents God's anger. It's that hot burning force as the mariner and the men get trapped in the doldrums, and I'll cover that more later. They begin to burn up, and you have that famous line, water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. So the sun becomes an important image. The crossbow represents the crucifixion cross. I've mentioned that earlier, but it certainly lends the religious theme to the work. And there again, in number 5, is your reference to the moon. So these become, I think, 5 good themes that you can develop as you go and read the poem. Now, I keep hearing myself say as you go through and do it. I had a college chemistry professor, Sister Katrina Hartman, who would say that all the time, and I guess I'm so scarred by it that I keep saying it. Either way, this is something important to have in your notes. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is written in the ballad form. So it's important for us to have a definition of ballad. I'm looking through my notes here because I had an excellent slide on the ballad and how it works. So the ballad, by definition, is a 4-line stanza in iambic meter. So it's a 4-line stanza in iambic meter so that it's something we're familiar with. So it sounds somewhat easy to read. So you know what an iamb is already, an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, and the lines have 4 metric feet. So that means 8 syllables per line. It means unstressed followed by a stressed syllable. Briefly went over this on the board the other day in class. And the second and fourth lines have 3 metrical feet. So it's alternating lines of iambs. So I almost said iambic pentameter. So it is iambic tetrameter followed by a line of iambic trimeter. I know that's a little dense and geeky, but again, it reminds us back to our concepts of meter. So that's the ballad. Now, as ballads were originally meant to be lyrics set to music, there was a noticeable musical quality to the rhythm of the lines. So the metric pattern in the arrangement of feet creates a noticeable musical quality to the rhythm. The typical ballad meter was an alteration between lines in iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter. Now, I just said that, so third time should absolutely be in your notes. Ballads were generally written in quatrains, and they had a regular rhyme scheme of A, B, C, B. A, B, C, B. Now, this may contradict what I said a little bit earlier, but you're going to look for those deviations as they occur in the poem. However, there are many different variations on the meter, so my notes just confirmed what I directly said. The main feature in the ballads was their narrative structure and the repetition of certain lines in even whole stanzas. almost like a refrain. So an example of the ballad stanza would be right in the beginning of the poem. It is an ancient mariner, and he stoppeth one of three. By thy long grey beard and glittering eye, now wherefore stoppest thou me? So the very first line of the poem gives us the ballad stanza example that we can track all the way through the rest of the presentation. So the ballad, again, is a very specific form of lyric poetry. The poem itself is narrative, as I said earlier, but the ballad stanza gives it that lyrical, musical quality. Now, why is the rhyme different from the typical ballad that we see throughout literature? In the poem, Rhyming the Ancient Mariner, the stanza is basically a four-line stanza, but there are stanzas that have 5 or more lines. So that right there deviates from the typical ballad form. The typical ballad rhyme scheme, AB, AB, is present but not regular. Again, reference what I said a few minutes ago about that exact same idea. The length of the story is atypical. It's rather long and drawn out. The long descriptions of natural phenomena and landscapes is not something we see in a ballad. Ballads tend to be all about character and not about the individual landscapes and picturesque descriptions. That makes it incredibly romantic. The moral drawn at the end of the poem is atypical. So you're going to be looking for the moral as we get to book the 7th. And the presence of the supernatural is a typical ballad characteristic. It just seems awfully larger in this one than we've seen in other particular poems. So you've got a lot of interesting concepts here about the ballad that contributes to the development of this poem.